Hello guys, so this is my beginner course for Python. So this course is designed specifically for people that are new to programming, that want to learn some basic programming concepts, and on top of that want to learn it in Python. So I'm going to be using the Python language. I'm going to kind of go over the history of Python. I'm going to go over some data types, variables, loops, etc. Right? So this is again very beginner course. So this course is for again the individual that doesn't know how to program, but they want to be get familiar, right? They want to get their foot in the door. They want to get started. They want to learn some concepts. And on top of that, they want to learn Python, the Python programming language. Python right now is very popular. It is a language that is very hot, you want to call it. But it's a language that's been around for a while, and we're going to talk about that in a bit. So again, this course, there's going to be many videos to this course. In this video today, we're going to be talking about the history and give you a basic introduction to Python. So that's the purpose of this video, and then there'll be many more videos after this to kind of go over the other topics related to Python. So let's go ahead and we're going to get started with who created Python. So guys, the creator of Python, let's start there, right? Anytime, again, if you're new, you want to get familiar with Python, let's kind of start from the beginning, right? Like how did Python even come to be? I know Python very popular today now, and it's been kind of hot for these last couple of years. But I remember when I started programming, I don't recall Python being as popular as the way it is today. I've been coding now in Python for probably like 10 years now, around there anyways. And back when I started, it was not as popular as today. I started using version 2.7, but now it's a hot topic. Everybody's using it. Everybody's talking about it. There's a lot, it's very trendy. But besides that, I actually like the language. I think it's a very useful and very powerful language as well. But let's go ahead and talk about like the history. Where did Python come from? So that by this man, Guido van Rossum, he is the creator of the Python language. So that's something, to keep in mind. He's the one that created the Python language. And Python was conceived back in the 1980s. Sometime in the 1980s is when Guido van Rossum, started developing this language. And it wasn't until 1989 when it first got implemented. So that was when it first really got implemented in 1989. Now the first major release wasn't until 1991. So the implementation piece was in 1989, but it wasn't the first major release. Really wasn't released until 1991, which in this case would have been the Python 0.9, right? So that was the first major release that was released back in 1991. From then on, Python has evolved throughout the time, right? Python has went through different versions. The newer version that if you were to go download today, it is Python 3.10 or 11, I believe, to be exact. But nevertheless, it's Python 3 is the major version that's out today. That version was released back in 2008. So we're already in 2023. So we're working with a version that's been pretty established, pretty stable, and has a big community. And that's one of the other things that I like about Python as well. The community is massive, and that what helps in my mind helps the language to be as strong as it is, because there is a big backing behind this language, and it's a fun, like, I actually like this language. I think it's powerful, and it's easy to use, and it's very fun to use as well. So there's a lot of aspects of it that I like. There's some downfalls to it, and we'll talk about that later, but I feel more good than bad, which is why for me it's actually my favorite language. But that's a whole different story. Guido van Rossum is the creator of Python. So I do want to touch bases on that to at least kind of give you a little bit insight of who created this language. So it's always good to know, right, the history and what versions are out as of right now. The major release that was back in 1991, that's over 30 years ago, guys. So that's another thing to keep in mind. This is not, even though Python may be trendy the last couple of years, it's not a language that just came out and became hot. Those languages are more likely to fail, in my opinion, because a lot of the time they're buggy, they're not stable enough to be used in production environments, whereas Python has over 30 years, guys, under its belt. It's been very fine-tuned. It is production grade, and it's actually utilized in a lot of big tech companies today in many different ways. It's even being utilized by some big websites today as well that's actually running their platforms. So again, there was a point in time back in the day, and we'll talk about this later, but some aspects of YouTube where it used to be utilized very heavy. So again, that's a whole different, discussion, but just kind of want to give you a little bit of insight related to that. One thing to keep in mind, if you're getting started today, right? You're new to Python, you're new to programming. The version of Python that you want to utilize at the minimal is Python 3.7. That is the interpreter version. And we'll talk about that a little bit more throughout these series in this course. But that is the minimal version that you should be utilizing. Python 3.7. There's no reason to be using 2.7 anymore. The only reason why you would use this old version, the reason why I say 2.7 to be precise, that was one of the latest version for Python 2. And when I started programming, there was a lot of applications that were built on 2.7. Now it's been years from then. So my hope is that a lot of these applications have been upgraded to at least Python 3, some version of Python 3. But nevertheless, guys, that's the only reason why you would utilize an old language. Besides that, there is no true need to utilize an older interpreter version. You should be using 3.7 at the minimal or higher. One of the things I want to talk to y'all about too is Python is a dynamic typed language, right? So keep that in mind. Well, there are different types. You have static and dynamic. And a language, just kind of give you a quick comparison, something like a C++, for example, C#, those are static type languages. They're very explicit. So what that means, and again, if you're new, it may not make much sense now, but you have to declare your variables. So if you're gonna create a variable, let's say it's called age, right? You got to declare it as a integer to know that you're gonna be storing numbers in this variable. Where in Python, it's very dynamic. You don't have to do that. By you specifying the number directly, it knows this is a number. So it kind of like auto determines, is this a text value, like a string, or is this a numerical value, like an integer, like a whole number? Or is it a decimal value, right? Whereas, it's 5.21. Then it will know that is a float value, which is again decimal value. Nevertheless, it's dynamic. Now, because it is a dynamic language, you need a interpreter to interpret the language. Think of an interpreter being like a middleman. So in Python programming, because you write code that is human readable code, when you run it, the interpreter will convert that code over to machine code. And when it converts it to machine code, now the machine could understand your request, but it does it on the fly. Now, because it is doing it on the fly, it is slower compared to what you may hear other languages that are out there, like let's say a C++ or a C#. These other languages, again, they're static type languages. These other languages they will get compiled. So when you write code, again, human readable code, you have to compile that language first, the code first. And when you compile it, think of it as whenever you download a program, a lot of the time, like in Windows, it's .exe, an executable file. Well, that's kind of what you're doing to some extent. When you have code like in C++ or C#, you have to compile it down. Think of it like an executable file. As it gets compiled down, now you'll be able to run the code. But when you run the code, it's going to be quick, like really fast. Because everything has already been, think of it as everything has already been packed into what's considered machine code. So when the machine reads it, there is no converting it from human, text code to machine code. It's already been converted for you and it just runs. So again, hopefully that makes sense a little bit. And I do have a video that I'll be talking about compiled and interpreter. Like what are interpreted and compiled? What's the difference? So I'm going a little bit more detail into that. But Python is a dynamic type language that requires a interpreter to run. So you need to have an interpreter to be able to run your code. So that's something to keep in mind. So the next thing, guys, we're going to be talking about how is Python utilized today. So today, guys, Python is being utilized in many different ways, and this is what makes Python very popular. It's not just being utilized for a specific area only. It's utilized in many different areas. Many. And let's go down the list. Automation. So automation, it's utilized a lot. There's a lot of companies that use it for a lot of small singular type tasks, right? It could be literally a small set of code that does very basic functionality. Kind of give you an example, you may have a folder. The folder may contain, 1,000 files in that folder. And now what you want to do, you want to rename all of the files. You want to kind of give them some kind of pattern, maybe apply some sort of suffix to the file, to each file that's in there. And in order to do that, Python will be very handy to do that. You could run a script that would literally iterate over all of the file names in that folder and rename it to the new file name. That's a good example. Probably would take no more than a few lines of code, and that would automate that process. And you could have a process where once it finished renaming, you could move the files over to some kind of other folder. And then now you could have that script, let's say, run at the end of the day. So every day there's more new files being dropped in that folder. It'll rename the files, then move them over to another folder. And that could be automated to run every night, once a day, every hour, etc. That's just a quick example when it comes to automation. That it could be utilized. Another one is a desktop application. So this is where I have a lot of familiarity because I have actually created a few desktop applications in my past. I don't create desktop applications now anymore just because my development is through web development. That's where I spend my focus. But I have created some desktop applications that did a lot of cool things. There's two main frameworks. There is a Tkinter framework, a package. Pretty much this package comes with Python. Very ideal. It's very good to create some basic desktop applications that could easily be compiled for Mac, Linux, or Windows. It doesn't matter. Any operating system, it'll work. There is a package called Qt. Now this package, it is free for your own personal projects, but if you're going to be selling an application and making money, there is a license that you got to purchase. What I like about the Qt framework package for Python is it makes it very, very easy to build out UI interfaces for your desktop applications. And it's very powerful. There's a lot of things you could do with it. A lot of things. So I would strongly recommend, if you're building desktop applications, look into the Qt framework, and that would help you out a lot. Another thing is web development. Python is used a lot for web development, man. A lot of backend stuff for web development. Even, the server rendering aspect of it. There's two main frameworks that Python utilizes today. These are not the only ones, but these are what I would consider the two main ones, Django and Flask. So those two frameworks, are heavily utilized for either API. If you need to create some sort of API web service, that's a framework. You could easily use Flask or Django, either one, for that API service, or just again a backend web service for, let's say, your website or your web app, right? That ultimately will render the pages. It, take all of the requests, be able to redirect it, render it, execute any processes on the back end, able to do all of that. Obviously, because this is the web, Python does not handle front end activity. That's kind of where JavaScript will come in. That is where, again, there's other frameworks that JavaScript uses, like React, Vue, etc., that could be utilized for a lot of the front end stuff. But nevertheless, everything else, that's where Python can be utilized for when you're dealing with web. Statistics. So Python is used a lot for that as well. A lot of people use it to do statistical analysis. It's one of the main programming language. There is another programming language, or scripting language, which is R. So R is strictly very useful for statistics. Python is utilized for statistics as well. My personal opinion, because I have done some testing with both, Python's performance is way faster, and that's because Python is not as fast as a language as, let's say, C++. But when you compare it against R and Python, I think Python is way more faster. So I think that if you need performance and you're dealing with statistics, and maybe you're already dealing with R Studio, I would recommend learn Python. And you could do a lot of the same things that you're doing in R at a faster speed. That's my opinion, but nevertheless, it's used for statistics. AI and machine learning. Pretty sure most people that are interested in Python to some point in time have heard a lot about AI and machine learning. Well, Python is utilized very heavily in that area as well. It's utilized a lot. So if you're into AI, machine learning, Python is probably your best choice, I would say. Data processing. Python is used a lot for this. Data processing is extracting data from files, right? Whether it be Excel files, whether it be CSV files, Parquet files, the list goes on. It's JSON files as well. It's used a lot of processes that are established right now, even like in AWS Glue services, the list, different these cloud services that are utilized to do a lot of data processing. They use Python. Python is being utilized underneath. Again, Python is not the fastest language, so it's like, well, why don't they use other faster languages like C++? And the thing about it, Python is not as fast as these other languages, but you could throw a lot of resource at it at once if needed, and have a lot of workers established to ultimately accomplish that workload at a reasonable speed. But again, going back, data processing. So if you're going to be doing a lot of data processing, again, extracting data, loading data to a database, maybe transforming data, parsing out data, then saving it out to a CSV flat file, things of that nature. Python's very good for all of that. Very, very good. So the last one I put out there, but here's the thing. So game development is the last one that you can do. I want to emphasize, you can do with Python. I just would not recommend it. If you're very serious into gaming, like you really want to do something legit, then I will use something like C Sharp, C++. Those are the languages that I would probably recommend to use, because as of right now, a lot of the engines, those are, the Unreal Engine, for example, you cannot use Python or some of the other languages, so I would, if you're a serious gamer, you want to make it something serious, get into that industry, then Python is not the language you want to learn. You would probably want to lean towards C Sharp and C++. But again, I want to put it on here because you can do game development. There are some games that I have seen that people have built. They're small, nothing big, type games that actually work fine. It works very well. But again, I feel like it's still very infant stage right now. And if you really are serious about gaming, then yes, C Sharp, C++ is the language to use. So the next thing, guys, I want to talk about is I want to talk about paradigms. So Python is considered a multi-paradigm language. So let's kind of talk about what is the first paradigm that Python is considered. So the first paradigm is functional programming. So I'm not going to go too detail of this paradigm. That's not the purpose of this, but just kind of try to give you a high level. Think of functional programming as, let's say, something basic like Excel. So you're familiar with Excel. Excel has functions, right? You have a sum function, an average function, a count function, and that's what it does. They're very explicit on what they do. They have specific purposes, and they only do that and that only, nothing else. Well, Python can be used for functional programming language. You could literally create functions that do very explicit things. So if that's your goal and that's something you want to utilize it for, Python allows that. And that's kind of where the paradigm comes in. How can the language, what are the different paradigm patterns that it could be utilized for? In this case, functional is one of them. So if you're trying to use it in that manner, then Python can be used for that. The next paradigm that we're going to talk about, and this is the more popular paradigm for Python, is object-oriented programming. Again, OOP, better known as OOP. Now, this paradigm is kind of what the name says, right? So object-oriented. So everything is objects. The way you handle everything are objects. Which again, an object can contain data. And an object can contain attributes in that object. Many different attributes. Your code base could be procedural. It could be formed in a procedural way. Like, again, the goal here not to go into detail what is object-oriented programming, the paradigm itself, but this is the more popular of the paradigms for Python. And this, so your code base can be structured in this paradigm. Again, it's called multi-paradigm for a reason, because it doesn't have just one way of doing it. There's other ways: functional, object-oriented programming. Then, of course, the final one that we're going to talk about is going to be procedural programming. So procedural programming, think of this as a step of sequences that you have. So if you write code, it's literally step 1, you do this. Step 2, you do this. Step 3, you do this. It's literally going to run it in that order. Maybe in those steps, step 1, it may call a function, things of that nature. It may do some sort of whatever it is that you want it to do. But it's only going to do it in that order. It's not going to do step 1, then step 5, then back to step 2. That's not how to work. Procedure, very structured. You're going to go in a specific route, and that's the only route. Like if you're driving from point A to point B, you cannot jump and teleport over to another spot. You're literally going to have to go through that path of point A to point B. And that's the only way to get there, and that's how the code is being ran, all in that sequence of steps. So hopefully that, again, I'm not trying to go too detailed into this procedural paradigm, but just want to kind of give you a little basic insight to it. So again, that's why Python is a multi-paradigm language, because we are dealing with these three paradigms. So the last thing, guys, that I want to talk to you about here is how is Python, like who uses Python today? And we're going to talk about a few big companies today that use Python. So here are some of the top companies that are using Python today. And a lot of these companies may be very apparent to you, all right? Google, Shopify, Netflix, Reddit, Dropbox, Stripe, Instagram. All of these companies use Python in one form or another. Some use it more than others. You know, kind of give you an example. Google, back in the day, this is back when Google was first conceived, it actually used Python for search. Now, as Google grew and became as big as what it is over time, you know, Python just could not handle the amount of search requests that it was getting. So ultimately, they did have to switch to another language, which they switched to Java, I believe, at the time. I'm not sure what they have now, but I want to say it was Java, if I recall correctly. But still, though, it handled it for some years. It was pushing a lot of requests, man, millions of requests, and it was able to handle it for some time. It just kind of shows you how powerful Python is. And this was back then when it was using the older version of Python 2, which is a bit slower than the newer versions that are out today. Then again, you got Dropbox, Stripe. So a lot of these, like Netflix, that I'm aware of as well, is Netflix uses it for their APIs. So their application has APIs that control everything. Again, APIs may be something foreign to you. You may be asking, well, what's API? Don't worry about it. I have a course that I'm working on that's going to go in very detail about APIs, Python specifically. But nevertheless, think of APIs of a mechanism that you could call URL, and then that URL will give you back data. And that's how you're able to communicate in your application, by just calling this URL and giving you back some data to render on your page, maybe a new image, right? Just like on Netflix, when you're scrolling down, you see new images pop up. But ultimately, all of that's calling the API. The API gets some new data to feed you, the user, and some of that data is images and it's text and things of that nature, right? So, but again, a lot of companies use it in different manners. I believe Dropbox uses, I don't know if it's a Django framework maybe, or Flask or something, but I want to say they're using one of the frameworks, or maybe it's Reddit. I can't remember what it is, but they're using one of the Python frameworks to run their platform. So again, people may say Python it should not be used for enterprise application, and Python is because it's not fast as C# and C++. You know, you should not be using it for, you know, very heavy traffic websites or heavy traffic applications. But other companies will say something different, because there's companies that are using it today, and these are companies that have millions of users, and they're processing millions of transactions per minute. So, and they use Python, and so it is doable by all means. And a lot of companies are using it. So hopefully this kind of gives you some insight of some of the big companies that are using it, and you know how they're using it. It does differ. Not everybody using it in the same manner, but it is being utilized in many different ways. All right, guys. So hopefully this video was beneficial to y'all, and many more videos to come related to the Python beginner course. Peace.